Mother, someone left enough firewood to keep us warm all winter.
Who would do such a thing?
If I send the wood and she doesn't need it, the cost is mine. If I don't, the cost is hers.
It was you, every winter?
For 5 years.
I simply couldn't bear the cost of being wrong.
The wood arrived on the first cold morning of every November. It arrived before dawn, before the village had opened its eyes, before even the earliest riser had put a kettle on. It arrived in a cart that made no particular sound on the frozen lane, and the wood was stacked against the side wall of the Holt cottage with a neatness that suggested a person who had done it before and knew how it should be done. And by the time anyone in the cottage was awake, the cart was gone, and the lane was empty, and the only evidence of what had happened was the wood, stacked and ready, enough to last the whole of the winter. The first time it happened, Maren Holt had stood at the side door of the cottage in her shawl and stared at it for a long time. She had been 21 then, and her father had died in September, and her mother was ill, and her younger brother Tom was 13 and doing what a 13-year-old boy could do toward the keeping of a household, which was not nothing, but was not enough, and the wood they had put by for the winter was going to run short by February, and she had known this, and had been carrying the knowledge the way she carried most problems, which was quietly and without telling anyone, because there was no one to tell who could help. And then the wood had appeared. She had asked in the village. She had asked carefully, not wanting to make a scene of it, just asking whether anyone knew who might have left wood at the Holt cottage, and nobody knew, or nobody said they knew, which in a village was sometimes the same thing, and sometimes not. The wood lasted the whole winter. In November of the following year, she was 22, and her mother was a little better, and Tom was 14, and working 2 days a week at the mill, and she had thought, perhaps last year was a kindness from a neighbor who did not want to be known, and perhaps it would not happen again. It happened again. Same morning, same darkness, same neat stacking, same quantity, enough for the whole of the winter. She stood at the side door and looked at it and felt something that was complicated to name, which was the feeling of being seen and helped by someone who did not want anything for it, which was so different from the usual shape of help, which had conditions attached and expected gratitude and arrived in the daylight where everyone could observe the giving of it. She went inside and made porridge and did not cry, mostly. By the 3rd year, she had accepted it. She did not know who it was, and she was not going to know, and the wood appeared, and her family was warm through the winter, and that was the whole of what she needed to know. By the 5th year, Tom was 17, and the mill had taken him on full time, and her mother had recovered enough to take in some sewing, and they were managing better, and she had thought, perhaps the wood would not come, perhaps whoever it was had seen that they were managing, and had moved the help to somewhere it was more needed. The wood came. She stood at the side door in the November darkness, and she looked at it, and this time she did think about who it was, not in a casual way, but seriously, with the full attention she brought to serious questions. She was not a foolish woman. She had grown up in Fenwick, and she knew its people. She had thought through the possibilities over the years, and she had eliminated most of them on practical grounds, because wood in that quantity cost money and time, and the people in Fenwick who had the money did not have the inclination, and the people who had the inclination did not have the money, and the intersection of those two things in sufficient quantity was a very small set. She thought about the estate. She thought about the Duke of Fenwick, whose name was George Ashton, and who was spoken of in the village in the way that people spoke of large, permanent things, reliably, and without great detail. She had no reason to connect him to the wood, except elimination. She had no proof of anything. She went inside and told Tom to bank the fire and went to bed and thought that she was going to find out, one way or another, before the 6th year came. She found out in October, before the 6th delivery, by accident, in the way that most true things were found out. She had been in the town of Cressmore, 12 miles from Fenwick, selling the embroidery work she had been doing through the summer for a shop there that bought her pieces reliably and paid fairly. She had finished her business at the shop, and she was crossing the market square when she saw a man she did not recognize talking to a merchant at the grain stall, and the conversation was the practical conversation of a man placing an order, and she would have walked past without a second thought, except that she caught one phrase, which was the Fenwick Lane cottages, and she stopped. She did not approach immediately. She stood at the edge of the square, and she listened, and what she heard was a man ordering firewood for delivery to 3 addresses in Fenwick, of which one was her own cottage, and the delivery was to be made before first light on the first cold morning of November, and the account was to be charged to the Ashton estate. The man placing the order was not the Duke. He was, she would learn, the Duke's land steward, a man named Pruitt who handled the estate's practical matters and was known in the town as a reliable account. She could have let it go. She had heard enough to know the source, and she could have gone home and continued as she had been, accepting the wood each year and not making anything more of it. She went home and she thought about it for 3 days, and then she sat down and she wrote a letter. She did not write to the steward. She wrote to the Duke. She wrote it in the plain way she did everything, without performance and without excessive formality, and she said that she believed she had identified the source of the wood that had appeared at her cottage each November for 5 years, and that she wanted to say thank you, and that she also wanted to say that she did not know why he had done it, or how he had known to do it, and she would like to understand that, if he was willing to tell her. She sealed it, and she sent it with the carrier, and she told herself she did not expect a reply, and she expected one. The reply came in 4 days. It was short. It said that he would call on Thursday at 2 o'clock if that was convenient, and it was signed with his first name, George, and nothing else. She told Tom, who had no useful response, except to look alarmed, and then try to look as though he had not looked alarmed. She told her mother, who said she would make sure the parlor was decent, and then went very quietly into the parlor and made it exceptionally decent. He arrived on Thursday at 2 o'clock exactly, on a horse, alone, without a groom, and he knocked at the front door the way an ordinary visitor knocked at a front door, and Maren opened it. She had seen him before, at a distance, at the parish church at Easter and at the summer fete. She knew his face in the general way. In the doorway of her cottage, he was simply a man of about 40, in a plain coat, and he said, "Good afternoon," and she said, "Come in." She took him to the parlor. Her mother had made it exceptionally decent. Tom had found reasons to be elsewhere, but she could hear him in the kitchen, doing a very poor job of being quiet. She offered tea. He said yes. She made it. They sat across from each other at the parlor table, with the tea between them, and she looked at him directly, because she was not a woman who looked at difficult things sideways. She said, "It was you." He said, "Yes." She said, "For 5 years." He said, "Yes." She said, "How did you know we needed it?" He said, "I ride the estate in October every year." He said, "I have done since I was young, to see the state of things before the winter, to know what the winter is likely to cost the people on the land." He said, I rode past your cottage 5 years ago in October, and I could see from the lane that the wood store was going to run short. She said, "You could see from the lane." He said, "A man who has managed an estate for 15 years knows what a winter's wood looks like stacked against a wall." He said, "Yours was going to last until January at most." She said, "It was going to last until February." He said, "I may have slightly overestimated." She looked at him. She said, "And the following years, we were managing better. Tom was at the mill." He said, "Yes." She said, "But you kept sending it." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "I kept riding past in October." He said, "The wood store was always better than the first year, and I thought several times that perhaps I would not send it, that you had it managed." He said, "And then I thought about the cost of being wrong." She said, "The cost of being wrong." He said, "If I did not send it, and the winter was hard, and the wood ran short, the cost of that was borne by you and your family. If I sent it, and you did not need it, the cost was borne by the estate, which could absorb it without difficulty." He said, "The calculation was not complicated." She was quiet. She said, "That is a very practical way to think about kindness." He said, "I have found that kindness without a practical foundation does not last very long." She said, "And the secrecy." He looked at her. She said, "You could have sent it with a note. You could have told us." She said, "For 5 years we did not know." She said, "I stood at the side door every November in the dark and looked at wood that had come from nowhere." He said, "Yes." He said, "I know." She said, "Why?" He said, "Because help that comes with the expectation of gratitude is a different thing from help that comes without it." He said, "I did not want you to feel that you owed me anything." He said, "And I did not want you to feel watched," which is what happens when a person knows that a more powerful person has seen their difficulty. It changes the way you walk through the world, knowing someone has seen you at your worst moment. She said, "And you thought I would feel watched." He said, "I thought you might." He said, "You are a proud woman." He said it plainly, not as a criticism. She said, "You do not know me." He said, "I have ridden past your cottage every October for 5 years." She said, "That is not knowing a person." He said, "No." He said, "It is not." He said, "But I have also heard you spoken of in the village." He said, "The school teacher told me once, when I was asking how the families in the north end of the village were managing, that the Holt girl would sooner manage on less than ask for help, and said it as a compliment." She said, "Mrs. Porter said that." He said, "Yes." She said, "Mrs. Porter talks too much." He said, "She said it with great admiration." Maren looked at the tea. She looked at the parlour that her mother had made exceptionally decent. She thought about 5 Novembers of standing in the dark at the side door in her shawl and looking at wood that had appeared from nowhere. She said, "My mother cried the first year." She said, "I did not tell her where it came from because I did not know, and she thought it was a miracle, and I did not have the heart to tell her miracles generally had a more ordinary explanation." He said, "And now?" She said, "Now she will want to know it was you, and she will want to thank you, and she will probably cry again, which I am warning you about in advance." He said, "I do not require thanking." She said, "I know you do not require it." She said, "She will want to give it, which is different, and you should let her." He looked at her. She said, "You are very good at the giving side of things." She said, "You should learn to receive." He said, "That is fair." She said, "Yes." She said, "It is." She looked at him across the table in the parlor her mother had made decent for a duke who had sent firewood for 5 years without a name attached to it, and she thought that she had spent 5 years trying to work out the shape of the person who had done this, and the shape was not what she had expected, which was that she had expected the shape of obligation, a man discharging a debt to the village, or guilt, a man salving a conscience, and the shape was neither of those things. The shape was simpler. It was a man who had ridden past a cottage in October and done the calculation and decided the cost of being wrong was not one he was willing to let her carry. She said, "The 3 addresses." He said, "I beg your pardon." She said, "In Cressmore." The steward was placing the order for 3 addresses. She said, "You send wood to 3 families." He said, "Yes." She said, "Every year." He said, "Yes." She said, "All of them the same way. Before dawn. No note." He said, "Yes." She said, "And you ride past them all in October?" He said, "Yes." He said, "It is a long ride." She said, "You ride the whole estate in October?" He said, "Every year." He said, "I started doing it when I was 22, and I inherited the estate, and I did not know what I had inherited, I mean the people of it, and I thought the only way to know was to ride it slowly and look carefully." She said, "And you have done it every year since?" He said, 18 years, yes." She said, "And in 18 years you have found 3 families who needed wood?" He said, 3 families who needed wood and could not easily ask for it. He said, "There are others who ask, and they are helped through the usual channels." He said, "The 3 I send to are the ones who would not ask." She said, "The proud ones." He said, "Yes." She said, "Mrs. Porter told you about me." He said, "Mrs. Porter did not need to tell me about you." He said, "A woman who stands at a side door in November in the dark and looks at wood that has appeared from nowhere and goes back inside and does not make a fuss about it." He said, "That tells you something about a person." He said, "I know what I saw when I looked at that wood store in October, and I know what I did not see, which was a woman who was going to knock on the estate door and ask." She said, "No." He said, "No." She said, "I would not have." He said, "I know." They sat for a moment in the quiet parlor. From the kitchen, there was the sound of Tom dropping something and then trying to be quiet about having dropped it. Maren said, "My brother is pretending not to listen from the kitchen." He said, "I had assumed." She said, "He is not subtle." He said, "No." She said, "He will want to shake your hand." She said, "He has wanted to shake the hand of whoever it was since he was 17 and worked out that the wood had to be coming from someone with money." He said, "He worked it out at 17. She said, "Tom is not as simple as he looks." She said, "None of us are." He said, "No." He said, "I know that." He said, "Miss Holt." She said, "Yes." He said, "I did not come today to receive thanks." He said, "I came because you wrote to me and asked me to explain, and the explanation was owed to you, and I wanted to give it in person and not in a letter, because letters are easy, and this was not a conversation for a letter." She said, "No." He said, "And because I have ridden past your cottage for 5 years, and I have wanted to know." He stopped. He said, "I have wanted to know if the shape of a person visible from a lane was the whole of them." She looked at him. She said, "And is it?" He said, "No." He said, "It is not the whole," he said, "but it was enough to make the ride worth making for 5 years, and the conversation today has given me a great deal more to think about than 5 years of October." She said, "You have 18 years of the estate in your head." He said, "Yes." She said, "And 3 addresses for the wood." He said, "Yes." She said, "And you rode 12 miles to sit in my parlor and tell me the calculation was not complicated." He said, "Yes." She said, "It was not a simple thing you did." She said it plainly, without making it soft. She said, "It was not simple, and it was not easy, and you did it anyway, and you did not want anything for it." She said, "I have been trying to think of someone else I know who would do that, and I cannot think of one." He said nothing. She said, "That is not a small thing." She said, "I want you to know, I understand, it is not a small thing, even if you are going to tell me the calculation was not complicated." He said, "The calculation was not complicated." She said, "I know." She said, "That is what makes it a large thing." He looked at her. Outside the parlor window, the November afternoon was doing what November afternoons did, going grey and cold with the particular efficiency of a season that had somewhere to be. The lane was quiet. The wood was stacked against the side wall, the 6th year of it, neat and sufficient. She said, "Next October." He said, "Yes." She said, "When you ride past." He said, "Yes." She said, "Knock at the door." He said, "Miss Holt." She said, "The wood store will be fine. Tom is at the mill, and my mother is better, and we are managing," she said. "The wood store will be fine, and you are welcome to see that for yourself, from the lane," she said. "But knock at the door anyway." He said, "And if I do?" She said, "I will make tea." He said, "You have just made tea." She said, "I will make more tea." She said, "There is no law against 2 cups of tea with a person you would like to know better." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "No." He said, "There is no such law." She said, "Good." She said, "It would be a poor law if there were." He looked at her across the parlor table in the November afternoon, and she looked back at him with the direct gaze of a woman who had stood at a side door for 5 years in the dark and asked nothing and received everything, and was now asking something small and receiving it the way she had always received things, that were offered honestly and without conditions, which was with both hands and without making a performance of it. From the kitchen, the silence had become very pointed. She said, "Tom." The kitchen door opened immediately, which confirmed that Tom had been standing directly behind it. He came into the parlor. He was 20 years old, and he had his father's hands and his mother's eyes, and he was looking at the Duke of Fenwick with an expression that was trying very hard to be composed, and was mostly succeeding. He said, "I would like to shake your hand." The Duke stood up. He shook Tom's hand. Tom said, "Thank you." He said it simply and completely and without elaboration, the way men said things when they meant them entirely and had no need to make them bigger. The Duke said, "You are welcome." And then Maren's mother came in from the back room, where she had been listening with less concealment than she imagined, and she looked at the Duke of Fenwick standing in her decent parlor, and her eyes did exactly what Maren had told him they would do. He received it without difficulty. He stayed for another hour. He left when the light was going, back up the lane on his horse, and Maren stood at the front door and watched him go, and thought about next October, and the knock at the door, and the tea, and she thought that 5 years of wood, stacked against a wall in the dark, was the longest introduction she had ever been given, and also, she thought, the most accurate one. She knew what she knew about him. She knew it in the way you knew things that had been demonstrated rather than stated, which was the only way of knowing things that lasted. The wood would come next November, she was certain of that. And so would he. And the year after that. And the year after that. Thank you for listening to this story, all the way to the end. Please tell us which city you are watching from, and what the story made you feel. Do not forget to subscribe so you will not miss the next one.